in which we meet a monk, a manuscript, and a little scribbled remark that refused to be forgotten. Picture a quiet monastery somewhere in the English countryside, around the year 1234. It's winter, the kind of damp, persistent cold that seeps through stone walls and settles into your robes, your bones, and occasionally your soul. The scriptorium, a long, narrow room filled with the faint scent of candle wax, sheep parchment, and silent frustration, is where our story begins. Or rather, where it was copied. The main character isn't a monk, though you'll meet several. Nor is it a book, though those loom large. No, this story belongs to a small, ink-smudged scribble in the margin of a thick manuscript. A single line, tucked in the lower left corner of a page that most readers never finish. "Oh Lord, let this copying end. My hand is cramping and the ink is freezing." Written in Latin, of course, though the sentiment is universal. If you've ever written a long essay at 3 a.m., you've met this monk in spirit. The author of this marginal note was Brother Simon of Oxbury Abbey, a quiet soul with a broad forehead and perpetually ink-stained fingers. He was not the abbey's best scribe. That honor belonged to Brother Osbert, whose handwriting was so elegant it once made a visiting bishop weep. But Simon was consistent, obedient, and unlikely to start a theological debate in the refectory, which made him ideal for long, tedious copying work. He spent his days hunched over a wooden desk, illuminated by a slanted shaft of gray light or the dim flicker of a candle stub. The manuscripts he copied were not glamorous. No shimmering gold leaf or illuminated dragons, just blocky theological commentaries, mostly written by men who thought metaphysics should be painful to read. Still, Simon worked. He copied line after line, hour after hour. And on this particular day, cold, damp, and entirely too quiet, he lost patience somewhere in Book 3, Chapter 14, Paragraph 8. The author had just launched into a particularly thorny argument about the nature of divine justice, which, to Simon, read like someone rearranging the same 10 Latin verbs in increasingly cruel combinations. His ink was running low, his hands were aching, and his stomach was loudly reminding him that the last thing he'd eaten was a questionable turnip. So he paused, dipped his quill, and instead of copying the next sentence, he scrawled a complaint. It wasn't a dramatic note, just a flicker of real human feeling, weary, cold, mildly sarcastic. Then he continued copying, as if nothing had happened. But here's the magic of history. The manuscript survived. The book, a ponderous volume bound in dark leather, ended up in a different abbey 2 centuries later, then in a nobleman's library, then, somewhat inexplicably, in a Georgian estate, where it was mostly used to prop up a wobbly bookshelf. And through all of this, Simon's tiny note remained. Other scribes read it. Some smiled. One added their own response in slightly neater script. "It was warmer yesterday. Count your blessings, brother." And so a quiet conversation began, one that would span generations. The manuscript's margins, once bare, began to accumulate tiny whispers, notes, scribbles, complaints, jokes, questions. Sometimes even drawings of questionable animals. A bored monk in 1379 sketched a dog chasing a nun. A frustrated novice in 1442 wrote, "This scribe is drunk, or my eyes deceive me," in response to a particularly messy passage. A serious scholar in 1521 underlined Simon's original complaint and added simply, "same," and thus the marginalia grew, not loud, not important, but very, very human. Meanwhile, the main text, the part they were all supposed to care about, remained largely unread. Heavy theological arguments, untouched by time or interest. But the margins? They were alive. There is a theory, unprovable, but comforting, that books remember. Not just the words written in them, but the hands that held them, the sighs breathed into them, the ink spills, the jokes, the fatigue. If that's true, then this manuscript, thanks to one tired monk and his cold fingers, became a quiet archive of centuries of readers. Simon never knew what he started. He died as he lived, quietly, probably during Compline, with a book near his bedside and a slightly unfinished page left on his desk. The abbey replaced him with another scribe. The work continued. But his note endured. Books in the Middle Ages didn't travel well. They were heavy, awkward, expensive, and prone to water damage, rat damage, fire damage, and, most dangerously, curious monks who thought they could fix the Latin. A single volume could weigh as much as a toddler, and transporting one often involved a cart, a tarp, 2 worried friars, and a whispered prayer that nothing fell into a ditch. So when Oxbury Abbey began its slow, reluctant relocation in the spring of 1312, due to flooding, poor land management, and a minor misunderstanding with a local baron involving pigs, the books went with them. Or most of them did. Brother Henricus was in charge of the library relocation. A man of great devotion and very little upper body strength, Henricus approached the task like he approached most of his duties, with a detailed list, a nervous expression, and an endless stream of whispered apologies to God, the Virgin, and whichever saint was responsible for logistics. The manuscript that contained Brother Simon's famous marginal note was labeled simply Theological Commentaries, Volume 5. It was not on anyone's top priority list, but Henricus had a fondness for big books and a fear of being haunted by vengeful scribes, so he made sure it got a place in the wagon, wedged between a cracked psalter and a damp copy of Lives of the Desert Fathers. The journey south was slow. Mud clung to the cartwheels like sin to a bishop. Rain fell in sheets. Oxen refused to cooperate. And somewhere near the village of Greystoke, the cart hit a rock and pitched sideways. The manuscript went flying. It landed in a puddle with a splash and a distinctly undignified thud. Pages flapped like startled doves. Henricus shrieked like someone had just murdered a saint. Fortunately, the manuscript was thick, well-bound, and slightly water-resistant. Thanks to centuries of accumulated grime, it survived with only a damp corner and some temporary crinkling near Book 2. The marginal note, still legible. If anything, the smudge at the edge of Simon's line made it look more artistic. Some later readers would even assume it was a deliberate flourish. An early example of what modern Instagram might call aesthetic decay. Eventually, the Abbey's books reached their new home, a modest priory with fewer rats and slightly better drainage. The new librarian was a man named Brother Ranulph, known for his unyielding love of order and his intense dislike of notes in the margins. So naturally, he found Simon's manuscript on day 3. He read the main text with dutiful disinterest. He read the marginal notes with barely concealed horror. He considered scraping them off, as was sometimes done. But that took effort, and Ranulph, for all his piety, had a touch of laziness where effort was concerned. Instead, he did what all overworked caretakers eventually do. He sighed, muttered, "God sees all," and shelved the manuscript under Commentarie Generalis, Miscellaneous. And there it stayed, for a while, until one winter evening, a novice named Elric pulled it down while looking for something to put him to sleep. Elric was 17, deeply enthusiastic, and had never seen a marginal doodle before. He laughed out loud at Simon's line, and the one below it, and the third one, which featured a tiny sketch of a dog sneezing into a candle. He showed it to his friend, then to his superior, then to a local visiting scholar who happened to be cataloging minor manuscript oddities. That's when the manuscript's life changed again. Because you see, while most books are read for their contents, this book was about to become famous for its commentary. Not the commentary in the main text, mind you, but the commentary in the corners. The notes, the complaints, the miniature drama in the margins, a record of not what was written but of how it was read. Time passed, as it tends to in monasteries, with a gentle rhythm of bells, candle wax, and complaints about porridge. The manuscript sat peacefully on its shelf, alongside dozens of others that smelled faintly of sheep and sanctity. But unlike its neighbors, solemn, untouched, and deeply boring, this one began to gain a reputation. Word spread among the novices. There's a book with jokes in it. It didn't take long for curious young monks to start pulling it down, not for research, but for entertainment. Not the main text, which still involved impenetrable theological arguments about divine intention versus ecclesiastical authority, a thrilling debate if you enjoy watching paint dry in Latin. But for the margins. They came for Simon's original line, "O Lord, let this copying end," and stayed for the others that had joined it. Brother Osbert's handwriting is like a swan, beautiful but only from a distance. Do not trust the ink pot by the window. It froze last night. Again. This page was copied during Lent. Forgive the mood. Some were complaints. Others, little poems. One simply read, "If you are reading this, I too was bored." It became a sort of quiet tradition. Novices, scholars, even bored abbots, all left their mark. Some signed their names. Others just left symbols. A star, a bird, a tiny fish with eyebrows. A monk named Theobald even started cataloging them in the back, writing, "Here follow the marginalia," being the honest voices of those chained to quills. He meant it as a joke, but that list became the manuscript's table of contents, not of theology, but of emotion. The book stopped being just a volume. It became a chronicle of human presence. Then, something unusual happened. A noblewoman came to visit the priory, Lady Cecily of Brampton, widow, educated, curious, and not particularly interested in the books the monks showed her, which were mostly designed to impress donors or lull sinners to sleep. She wandered past the open library shelves and pulled down the one book that looked well thumbed. The monks blanched. Not that book. That was the joke book, the one with the tone. But it was too late. She opened to the first marginal note, read silently, then smiled. And, scandalously, she laughed. Not a loud, unholy guffaw. Just a soft, surprised laugh, like someone bumping into an old friend where they least expected it. "Who wrote this?" she asked. The monks shrugged. No one. Everyone. It wasn't the real text after all. Cecily closed the book carefully, nodded, and said something no one expected. "I should like to copy it." And so, the manuscript left the priory, temporarily, and under much clerical muttering, to be recopied by Lady Cecily's private scribe. She didn't care about the main commentary. What she wanted was the marginalia. Every note, every sketch, every line of complaint, wit, and strange humor scrawled by candlelight over the centuries. Her copy, bound in green leather, became something unique. A book of commentary without commentary. Just margins. Just voices. She called it Whispers in the Margins. But the original? That stayed behind, resting in its familiar slot, a little worn, a little swollen from moisture, its pages softer from years of fingers tracing lines never meant to be read aloud. It had become a strange thing, a book whose meaning wasn't in what was written, but in what was added. Books are patient travelers. Unlike people, they don't argue about where to sit or forget to pack a second tunic. They don't mind delays or bad roads. And they never ask, "Are we there yet?" They just ride, wrapped in cloth, bundled under cloaks, jostling in the bags of clerics, scholars, and curious nobles. This is how the manuscript, Simon's book, left England. The exact route is lost to history, but the best guess involves a visiting scholar from Bruges, a mild case of mistaken ownership, and a donkey that had no business carrying that much weight. Whatever the cause, by 1473, the book had found itself in Flanders, and things began to change. For one, the marginal notes were no longer just in Latin. The new owners, scribes in a Flemish abbey, added their own thoughts, not as witty perhaps, but still personal. It rains again. I have counted 17 days without sun. This ink is poor. I blame Brother Matisse. The rooster crows during none. He is excommunicated. The margins were now multilingual. Latin still dominated, but Dutch, French, and even a scrap of early Italian appeared. One scribe drew a tiny face near Simon's original note and wrote, in a particularly neat hand, "This monk knew despair. I salute him." Some of the newer marginalia took strange turns. One page contains a half-finished map of a village, labeled, "Where the good beer is kept." Another has a miniature diagram of a trebuchet, with a side note, "Not to scale, sadly." At some point, a small child, likely the bored son of a noble visiting the abbey, discovered the manuscript and added 3 chickens, a crown, and what may be an attempt at a dragon or a very distressed goose. The monks, rather than scolding, simply wrote beneath it. The artist's intention is unclear but enthusiastic, and so the book became a polyglot palimpsest of emotion and observation. No longer just a theological commentary, but a patchwork of the medieval mind, its boredom, humor, irritation, weather reports, and livestock-related grievances. When the printing press arrived in Flanders, many old manuscripts were discarded, recycled, or stripped for their parchment. But this one survived, almost certainly because someone couldn't quite bring themselves to toss a book that contained, on page 312, the legendary line, "This quill is cursed. It writes only lies." The manuscript eventually made its way into the private library of a minor noble in Ghent, where it shared a dusty shelf with falconry guides and forgotten marriage contracts. It wasn't read often, but when it was for the margins. And somewhere, if parchment has memory, Simon's ink-stiff fingers twitched in approval. By the early 1600s, the manuscript had become what we'd now call a curiosity. It still sat in the nobleman's library in Ghent, largely ignored by its owner, who preferred maps of the New World and books with more gold on the cover. But every once in a while, when the fire crackled low and the night felt particularly long, someone would pull it from the shelf and flip through the pages, not for theology. That had aged poorly. But the margins? Still charming. Especially the page where someone had written, in florid French, "The monks complain too much. But I, too, have copied recipes by candlelight. My respect." Unfortunately, Europe in the 17th century wasn't known for its stability. Wars broke out like poorly timed festivals. Religious, political, personal, and occasionally all three. When the city was raided in 1648, the house in which the manuscript lived was looted. The books were tossed into crates, some burned, some vanished. Simon's manuscript ended up in a pile marked "Various Theology" and was sold to a Dutch trader who had no idea what it was, but liked the cover. He paid 2 florins and a sack of pepper. The trader brought it back to Amsterdam, where it sat in a warehouse for nearly a decade, protected only by dust and disinterest. Then, fate struck again, in the form of a woman named Margaretha Hahn, a bookseller's daughter with a taste for the strange and slightly sarcastic. While helping her father catalog old volumes, she found the manuscript. She flipped through it, snorted at a Latin doodle of a fish with legs, and promptly declared, "Father, this one is mine." She displayed it in their shop, open to a particularly active page that read, "I have spilled ink again. My hands are black. So is my soul, perhaps." Margaretha called it her book of miserable monks, It drew attention. Some customers laughed, some frowned. One clergyman tried to buy it just to destroy it, muttering something about irreverence and goats. But Margaretha refused to sell. Years later, when she did eventually pass the shop to her nephew, she gave him a single instruction: keep that one safe. It knows too much. He didn't, of course. Nephews rarely do. The book passed through hands like a coin: collectors, scholars, a slightly shady Jesuit, and eventually a London auction house sometime around 1735. There it was listed as a curious Latin theological volume, unnamed, bound in leather. Margins contain notable additions, possibly humorous. It sold for £3 to a gentleman who wore velvet and smelled of lavender and ink. The auctioneer couldn't remember his name, only that he said, "I prefer books that speak back." Back it went onto another shelf, now in a townhouse near Covent Garden, where it rested between a broken Greek lexicon and an unopened volume on early medicinal practices. It wasn't the most glamorous book, but it was the most read. Visitors would take it down, chuckle at a monk's complaint from 300 years ago, and inevitably whisper, "Someone else felt this too." That's what kept it safe. Not its theology, not its leather, but its margins. Messy, human, slightly inappropriate. The part that wasn't supposed to matter at all. And the note that started it all, still there. A little faded, but legible. Oh Lord, let this copying end. By the early 1800s, books had begun to lose their weight, literally and figuratively. They were smaller, faster to print, cheaper to produce. People no longer chained them to desks or kissed their covers. They stacked them, shelved them, carried them in coat pockets. The age of the manuscript had ended. But Simon's manuscript, by now creaky, cracked, and held together by more willpower than binding, had survived. It passed into the hands of one Lord Alverston, an amateur antiquarian with a weakness for old books and a tendency to forget where he put them. He donated most of his collection to a small college library in Oxford in 1841, possibly by accident, possibly because he needed space for a new billiards table. The librarians were less than thrilled. It arrived in a trunk with a note. Books of some age, possibly valuable, some with additions. Most were discarded or sold off. But one young cataloger, fresh from Cambridge and still naive enough to read everything, opened Simon's book and laughed. Right there, on a page somewhere near the middle, next to a dry passage about divine will, someone had written, "If divine will includes more copying, I object." He kept reading, page after page, marginalia after marginalia. He jotted notes, annotated the annotations, and eventually, in an act of bureaucratic mercy, gave the book an official entry in the college archive. It read, "Anonymous theological commentary, circa 13th-17th century, noted for extensive marginalia of historical interest. Housed in special collection, shelf D17. And that's where it sat. Dust settled. Students walked past it. Professors requested newer texts. Modern readers sought cleaner copies. But every once in a while, someone curious, lost, or simply procrastinating would pull it from the shelf. They'd open it, read the first marginal note. "Oh Lord, let this copying end," and smile. Then they'd find the others. Some would add their own. In the back pages, where the parchment had long since given up being useful, someone, probably a student from 1954, scrawled, "Still copying, still cold, but I think I love this." Another added in neat modern script, "Hello, Brother Simon, you made it." The book had become a chorus, quiet, sprawling, warm. It held not only one voice, but hundreds. It was proof that reading, even in silence, is always a conversation. It's still there, Shelf D17. Slightly crooked. Leather peeling. No longer important to anyone in charge, which is the safest place for any real treasure. It waits, patient as always, ready for the next reader to turn the page and think, "Ah, someone else has felt this too." In the early 20th century, libraries began to change. They became quieter, oddly enough, more modern, less about prayer and ink stains, more about catalogs and decimal systems. The college library at Oxford, where Simon's manuscript lived, was no exception. Electric light came, dust was banished. Wooden ladders gave way to quiet stools. The faint scent of wax and old parchment was slowly replaced by that universal aroma of mildew, optimism, and student anxiety. Somewhere in the midst of these changes, the manuscript was quietly relocated. It had never been considered particularly valuable. There were fancier books, older books, books with gold and bloodlines. But one librarian, precise, serious, and perhaps a bit paranoid, decided that any manuscript with 13th century parchment deserved to be treated with caution. Especially since a careless undergrad had spilled tea near it last term, so it was placed in the rare books room, then into a small wooden cabinet, then behind a locked glass case inside that cabinet. There it sat, forgotten again, but now in style. The key was tiny, brass, kept in a drawer labeled Miss Cabinet Keys. As you might imagine, no one remembered which key went to which cabinet. At some point, the drawer itself was moved, possibly during a reorganization, possibly because someone needed space for biscuits. Years passed. The manuscript became a rumor, a legend among student assistants. They spoke of the weird old book with the rude monks, unsure if it was still real or had been transferred or buried under a shelf collapse in 1952. The truth? It was still there, locked behind glass, waiting until the autumn of 1971. Enter Julian, graduate student, slightly disheveled, studying medieval theological commentary, but secretly more interested in the people who wrote it than in what it said. He was researching marginalia, the official kind, glosses, commentary, diagrams of questionable logic, footnotes written a century before footnotes were a thing. His supervisor, a man named Professor Atwell, assigned him a dull but necessary task: to inventory non-standard annotations in unindexed manuscripts. In other words, read everything nobody else wanted to read. Julian didn't mind. He had a thermos of weak tea, a fondness for long silences, and a growing suspicion that all the best voices in history were the ones scribbled in the corners. It was while searching through an old librarian's handwritten index cards, curled, tea-stained, and wildly inconsistent, that he found one marked simply MS 147, Theological Commentary, Significant Marginal Remarks, in storage. He followed the trail, down corridors, into dusty annexes, past a shelf of forgotten almanacs, and one particularly aggressive potted fern. Finally, he found the case. The manuscript stared back at him from behind smudged glass. Faded, bound in dark, peeling leather. A little lopsided. He recognized the hand. Not the scribe's. He wasn't that good. But the style, the rhythm. Marginalia. Real marginalia. Honest, irritated, human. He tried the cabinet. Locked. He found the key drawer. Empty. He asked the archivist. She laughed. That one? No one opens that cabinet. No one's sure it can be opened. Challenge accepted. It took him 3 weeks, one misplaced master key, and a very long lunch break. The cabinet opened with a reluctant click. Inside, the manuscript waited. A little more brittle, a little more bowed, but still there. Still whole. Julian carried it to a desk with a reverence usually reserved for relics or particularly delicate cats. He opened to the first page, and there it was, Simon's note. "Oh Lord, let this copying end. My hand is cramping and the ink is freezing." He laughed, quietly, then kept reading. For hours, every scribble, every complaint, every doodle of a chicken or tired angel. He filled a notebook with entries, made a map of the notes, cross-referenced handwriting styles, tracked the evolution of sarcasm by century, and then, in an act of academic rebellion, he wrote a paper, not about the theological commentary, but about the margins. His supervisor was unimpressed. "This isn't theology," he sniffed. "No," Julian said. "It's history." He didn't get top marks, but a visiting archivist from Cambridge read the paper, called it unexpectedly vivid, and invited Julian to present it at a minor conference with very bad catering. And there, the manuscript's journey shifted again, because someone else in the audience knew where another copy had gone. The conference was held in Cambridge, in a drafty hall that smelled like tea leaves and academic compromise. It was called Textual Variants and Peripheral Commentary in Preprint Europe, which sounds thrilling if you're the kind of person who enjoys tracing the evolution of semicolons. There were perhaps 30 people in attendance, half of them speakers, the other half hoping for sandwiches at the end. Julian was the youngest by a decade, and the only one with visibly ink-stained fingers. Not from quills, of course, but from hours spent flipping through fragile manuscripts and jotting notes in a fountain pen that refused to cooperate. His talk was short, just 20 minutes. He titled it, rather dramatically, Theological Silence and Marginal Rebellion, MS 147 and the Annotated Soul. There were polite nods, some confused frowns, a snort from the back when he read Simon's original line aloud, but when he finished, there was a pause. Then a hand went up. It belonged to Dr. Imogen Lofton, an archivist, historian, and one of the rare people whose entire personality could be accurately described as respectfully fascinated. She waited for the room to quiet. "Did the manuscript contain," she asked, "a note about a cursed quill that only writes lies?" Julian blinked. "Yes," he said. "Page 312. She smiled. "I think I've seen its twin." After the talk, she invited Julian to tea in a library that smelled less of books and more of lemon polish and controlled humidity. She explained. While cataloging a minor Nobles-donated collection, she'd come across a manuscript with an oddly conversational tone. It was technically theological, some commentary on Psalms, but the margins told a different story. At first, she thought the scribbles were incidental, but then she saw the pattern. The same voice, the same dry wit, the same tired Latin, and then the note. "Cursed quill. Writes only lies. I miss my old one." She hadn't connected it to anything until Julian read the same line aloud during his talk. She brought the book out, bound in green leather, thinner than MS 147, but clearly of similar age and style. They opened it together. There it was, the line, nearly identical in the same spidery 13th century script, but below it, something new, a response. "Get better quills, stop blaming tools." Signed, EM 1421. Julian stared. This wasn't just a copy, it was a dialogue. The margins had been copied with the text, which meant someone, Lady Cicely perhaps, or her scribe, had deliberately preserved the annotations, and then later readers had continued the conversation. The marginalia had become part of the manuscript's DNA. More than that, it had become a tradition. Over the following months, Julian and Imogen traced the manuscript's echoes. They found 4 known copies, all handwritten, all containing fragments of the original notes. Each had additional marginalia, Notes about weather, illnesses, funny dogs, bad sermons, lost quills, and in one case, an unfortunate incident with bees in a chapel. The main text remained unread by most, but the margins, they grew, like ivy, across borders, across languages, across centuries. And here's the strange part. In the margins of one copy, in an Italian hand from the late 1600s, someone had written, "If you are reading this, we are still alive." Julian copied that line into his own notebook, underlined it twice, and circled it the next morning while sipping lukewarm instant coffee in the archives. That's the thing about marginalia. They start small, as complaints, as jokes, as sighs between lines, but left alone, they multiply, not like bacteria, like memory. And Julian began to wonder, were there more copies? Was this manuscript just one root of a much larger tree? It was time to find out. Julian didn't intend to become obsessed. At first, it was just professional curiosity, then academic interest. Then, without noticing the line being crossed, he found himself muttering about marginalia in the shower, dreaming of scribe initials, and creating spreadsheets labeled things like Angry Monk 1, possibly Osbert. Even his cat, a dignified creature named Luther, had started sleeping on piles of manuscript printouts, as if attempting to stage an intervention through fur and disapproval. The question wasn't just where the original marginalia came from. That was settled. Simon had started it. The question was, how far did it spread? Because it wasn't just the main manuscript anymore. With Imogen's help, Julian had identified 5 full or partial copies, all from different centuries and locations: England, Flanders, Italy, France, and what appeared to be a monastery ledger in Prague that someone had lovingly repurposed into a commentary journal, complete with doodles of saints in increasingly dramatic hats. Each version preserved not only the main theological commentary, barely legible in places, like the text was holding on out of habit, but also some of the notes from previous readers. And then added their own, and those later notes started replying to each other. In the margin of one Flemish copy, next to a grumpy remark about ink freezing, someone from the 1600s had written, "Try warming it by the lamp, not the fireplace. Your previous advice nearly set my beard on fire." Further down, another scribe had replied, "Noted, beard intact, pride, less so." The tone was always the same, wry, weary, deeply human. Julian began to map the references. The same lines repeated. Certain symbols, stars, fish, spirals, appeared across versions. Some writers even signed their initials, or left marks scholars now recognized as personal glyphs. One was just a sleepy-looking face with a halo, and the caption, "Saint Exhaustus, patron of late-night scribes." To keep track of it all, Julian created a digital database. Each manuscript became a node, each annotation a thread. He color-coded them by century, drew connection maps, even used linguistic analysis tools to identify shifts in tone, spelling, and handwriting across centuries. He called it, half-jokingly, the Quiet Network. Imogen helped digitize high-resolution scans from European archives. She had contacts. She had patience. And, most importantly, she knew how to sweet-talk museum curators who weren't keen on lending out 14th-century books to overexcited grad students. Together, they built a small but growing archive of marginalia, not just from the original lineage, but similar commentary clumps from other forgotten books. It turned out Simon's manuscript wasn't alone in this trend. There were others, unrelated texts, random volumes, but all with margins that had been used not for scholarly correction, but for living. It was like finding a second layer of medieval Europe, one that wasn't recorded in royal charters or church decrees, a Europe of tired scribes, of students doodling during lectures, of frustrated monks, of bored readers. A Europe that mumbled back. The project attracted attention, first from a few niche medievalist forums, then from university libraries looking to digitize underused archives, then from a small, well-funded research group in Germany called Project Manuscript Echo, which offered them a grant. Julian was stunned. Imogen simply said, "Well, I hope you've got room in your calendar. We're going hunting." They planned a route: Ghent, Florence, Prague, Avignon. Not for the grand cathedrals or tourist sites, but for the basements, the locked cabinets, the dusty archive drawers no one had opened since before the steam engine was a rumor. Everywhere they went, they searched not for gold leaf or clean calligraphy, but for the odd scribble, the frown face in the corner, the "why are we still writing about sin" comment wedged between two lines of Latin, the quiet voices that had slipped past history's spotlight. And through it all, Simon remained. His note, the first, the simplest, echoed in every new margin they read. "Oh Lord, let this copying end." But it hadn't. Not yet. There's something inherently mysterious about private collections. The big libraries get all the glory. Marble columns, temperature control, carefully indexed files. But the private collections? They're chaos in velvet gloves. Dusty shelves, rooms that smell like pipe smoke and furniture polish, handwritten catalogs filed under sort of important things. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, magic. Julian had received the letter 3 weeks earlier. It was handwritten, in careful, old-fashioned script. "Dear Mr. Everly, I was informed by a colleague that you are studying marginalia in medieval manuscripts. I believe one of the books in my family's collection may be of interest to you. It contains what appear to be commentary conversations. Would you care to visit?" It was signed, Cordelia Bryony, Westmoreland House. He almost ignored it. It sounded too neat, too convenient. But Imogen looked up from her laptop and said, "What's the worst that could happen? You find a book, or at least a decent biscuit." So they went. Westmoreland House sat on a misty hill, draped in ivy and the kind of quiet that makes clocks tick louder. The library was vast and personal, filled with ancestral portraits and rows of books that hadn't been cataloged since Queen Victoria had opinions about things. Cordelia Bryony met them in the front hall. She was white-haired, sharp-eyed, and walked like someone who still believed in good posture and worse tea. "I've always liked that one," she said, leading them toward the library. The margins, they always seemed honest. The book in question wasn't even shelved. It was lying on a side table, half wrapped in linen. Cordelia unwrapped it gently like a sleeping animal. Julian stared. He recognized the cover, the green leather of Lady Cecily's scribe, but the color had faded to moss. The spine was cracked, the edges frayed, but it was unmistakably a sibling to Simon's manuscript. They opened it slowly. There was the cursed quill note. There was the drawing of Saint Exhaustus. There was the excommunication of the rooster. And then, new notes. Notes Julian had never seen. A long, spiraling column down the inner margin of one of the central pages. Carefully written. In English. "Modern ink." Cordelia cleared her throat. "My grandfather found this during the war. Bought it in Italy. From a bookseller who thought it was just scrap parchment. He read it and couldn't stop. He added notes. Letters. Pages of them." Julian looked closer. Each new note was a reply. To Simon, to the scribes in Bruges, to the reader in Florence, to someone named E.M., who might have lived in the 1400s and liked complaining about candles. Julian read aloud. "Simon, I think you would have liked my grandfather. He also hated cold ink and endless work. He once said, 'If you write long enough, eventually you'll find someone listening.' I think that's true, because I'm listening and writing back." A reply. Across centuries. Ink layered on ink. In the final pages of the book, a modern note, in a woman's hand, clearly Cordelia's, read, "This book belongs to all of them. I just keep it warm. Julian closed the cover with shaking hands. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in the entire project, he had no analysis. No citation, no theory, just silence. And the soft weight of memory. They spent the rest of the day cataloging the manuscript, taking photos, scanning every page. Cordelia served shortbread and refused to be interviewed. She only said, "Stories don't need permission. They just need someone to turn the page." Back at the university, Julian and Imogen uploaded the new pages to the Quiet Network. The responses poured in: scholars, students, strangers. People who didn't know what theological commentary was, but knew what it meant to feel tired, or unseen, or joyful in an unexpected line of scribble. They added their own notes. Digitally, of course, but still, marginalia. The tradition continued. Simon had written his line as a complaint, a sigh, a weary scribble. "Oh, Lord, let this copying end." And in a way, it had. But also, it hadn't. When the Quiet Network launched, it was little more than a digital archive. Scanned pages, translation notes, diagrams of marginal relationships. Niche, obscure, perfect for scholars with elbow patches and strong tea preferences. But then, someone tweeted about it. The tweet was short. "There's a 13th century monk who hated his job, and he's been sarcastically replying to readers for 800 years. This is now my favorite thing on the internet." It went viral. Within 48 hours, the site had 40,000 visitors. The servers wheezed. The loading wheels spun in despair. Julian sat in front of his laptop at 2:13 a.m., whispering, "Oh no," into a mug of cold coffee, while Imogen, half asleep, typed backup plans with one hand and buttered toast with the other. But the people didn't stop coming. Artists, historians, coders, students, teachers, retirees, skeptical uncles, teenagers who found comfort in a 1,000-year-old complaint about ink stains. Some read silently. Others posted responses. They weren't all academic, and that was the beauty of it. Some were emotional, others funny. Some simply said, "Me too." One woman wrote, "I copied your line onto my notebook during a rough week at work. Thank you, Brother Simon. You were right. My hand also cramps." Someone made stickers. Another made a lo-fi music mix set to ambient library sounds and medieval scribes muttering in the background. A small press in Canada asked to publish a translated selection of the best marginalia, titled "Voices in the Margins, Notes from the Longest Conversation." And then came the school letters. A teacher from Boston sent a package. Her students had read about Simon in the book, and each wrote a reply. They were handwritten, folded neatly, decorated with stars, dragons, and one impressively realistic drawing of a very annoyed medieval chicken. One student, age 9, wrote, "Dear Monk, I am bad at spelling and I hate writing, but you are funny. Did you have snacks? Please say yes. Love, Mia." Julian nearly cried. So did Imogen, though she blamed the dust. They added the letters, with permission, to the archive. A new section, Modern Margins. It filled quickly. The project became more than a website. It became a living document, a 1,000-year-long conversation between the past and the present, between a cold monk in a stone room and a graphic designer in Melbourne, between a scribe in Florence and a college student in Seoul, between writers who never imagined they were writing for anyone at all. That was the secret. Simon didn't set out to be remembered. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was just cold, tired, sarcastic, human. And because of that, he endured. Julian was invited to speak about the project in places that had never heard of theological commentary: art schools, mental health workshops, writing retreats. He brought the same story each time, of a voice in the margin that refused to vanish. Sometimes people asked if he made it up. He smiled. "No," he said. "But even if I had, wouldn't it still matter? Late one night, back in the Oxford Library, Julian pulled the original manuscript from its new archival sleeve. It was safer now, digitized, studied, protected, but still real. He opened to that familiar page, read the line, "Oh Lord, let this copying end." And then, in pencil, on an approved archival slip tucked gently between the pages, someone had added a final reply. It didn't end, but it got better. When people think of publishing, they imagine bold titles, shiny covers, and the distant thump of someone clearing space on a bookstore shelf. But when Julian and Imogen finally agreed to publish a physical edition of The Quiet Network, they didn't want any of that. They wanted something quieter. A book that felt like a whisper, something you could fall asleep to. It took nearly a year, not because it was difficult. The material was there after all. 1,000 years of marginalia. But because they wanted it to feel right. Not loud, not grand, just human. They called it a book of whispers. No subtitle, no flashy endorsement. Just a pale linen cover, the title stamped in soft gold, and a single marginal drawing. That tired monk's doodle of a fish wearing a hat. Inside were selections from the original manuscript, translated side by side with the marginalia. Each page had space in the margins for modern readers to write their own notes. They dedicated it to Brother Simon, and to everyone who ever scribbled in the margins instead of underlining the main point. The book did something unexpected. It didn't just sell, it stayed. It landed on bedside tables, in therapists' waiting rooms, on desks beside laptops, tucked between planners and coffee mugs, not as a scholarly tome, but as something else, a companion. People wrote in their copies, not reviews, responses. They posted them online, sent photos, wrote blog posts titled things like, "This monk gets me," and "I've been writing marginalia since 5th grade, now it's canon." One reader wrote, "I keep it by my bed. I read a page before sleep. It reminds me I'm not the first to feel overwhelmed by ink and expectations." Another shared, "I'm recovering from burnout." Reading about these scribes complaining about the same thing centuries ago, that's healing. And then there was the letter from a hospice nurse in Dublin. "I read one note a night to my patients. They like the one about the cursed quill." One woman said, "Finally, a book that doesn't preach at me." Julian kept these responses in a folder labeled Modern Echoes. It was full within 6 months. Somewhere between a memoir and a manuscript, the book became a kind of comfort. It wasn't about what it taught, it was about what it remembered. That voices don't need to shout to be heard. That even a single line in the corner of a forgotten page can outlive empires. That being tired and honest and a little funny, sometimes that's enough. The most popular page in a book of whispers wasn't even Simon's. It was from a later scribe, possibly in the 1400s, who wrote, "If you are lonely, know that someone else has been here too. We are many, we are scribbling." Underneath, in light pencil, modern readers added their own thoughts. Still here. Reading this on a train. Needed it today. This page knows me. And so the manuscript, once a complaint in the cold, became something else. A bedtime story. Not for children. Not just for scholars, but for anyone who's ever sighed into a notebook and hoped it mattered. Julian once said in an interview, "History tends to remember kings, but books remember scribes. And scribes, well, they remember us back." You wouldn't expect a medieval manuscript to end up in a virtual reality exhibit, but then again, you wouldn't expect a 13th century monk to be quoted in a podcast about burnout, or tattooed onto the arm of a Belgian programmer. Still copying. Still cold. History, as it turns out, has great range. When A Book of Whispers reached its 2nd anniversary, the project caught the attention of the European Memory Institute, a quiet but deeply ambitious initiative focused on preserving cultural fragments in both digital and physical forms for the next 1,000 years, as their website humbly suggested. They reached out to Julian and Imogen with a simple proposal. What if the next reader isn't born yet? Would you still write in the margins? The answer was obvious. A new version of the Quiet Network was built. Not just a website, but a virtual library. Visitors could walk through a 3D rendering of a medieval scriptorium. Candles flickered, quills scraped, books sat open on wooden stands. Each manuscript was clickable, zoomable, scrollable, and every marginal note was preserved. But here's where it changed. Users could leave their own annotations. In the margins. Digitally, yes, but in ink-styled strokes, mapped in their native languages, tagged with dates and locations, if they chose. It became a digital wall of whispers. A place where the old met the new, not with a bang, but with a quiet, shared grin. And then came the part no one expected. One of the Institute's partners, a university involved in space archival research, offered a spot for a data capsule on an upcoming orbital preservation mission. It was called the Vox Terra Project, a capsule designed to store and transmit snippets of humanity, languages, music, recipes, stories. Julian's manuscript, Simon's scribbles, the doodles, the sarcasm, the stars, was chosen as the literature fragment. 1,000 years after a monk dipped a tired quill into freezing ink and wrote, "Let this copying end," his line was uploaded into a spacecraft and launched into low Earth orbit. It now circles the planet 16 times a day. It will do so for at least the next 200 years. In a small, rather understated ceremony in a library courtyard, the launch was acknowledged with a reading of the margins. Imogen stood by a projection screen showing the capsule drifting past clouds. She read, "If you are reading this, we are still alive." Then she smiled and added, "We're just orbiting now." People often ask Julian if the project is done. He always gives the same answer. Of course not. Margins are infinite. We're just adding pages. And somewhere, in a rotating capsule above the world, a single phrase floats with all the others. Still copying. Still cold. But now, we're global. It wasn't planned. The final annotation came not at a conference, or a formal gathering, or during a live-streamed lecture with thousands of viewers. It happened on a Tuesday. In a public library. Somewhere in Yorkshire. The weather was unremarkable, gray with a hint of drizzle. The kind that makes you stare out windows and reconsider your entire afternoon. The library was warm. Quiet, mostly empty save for a pensioner snoring softly in the corner and a teenager flipping through a travel magazine with no intention of going anywhere. Ellie was 23. She had a cracked phone, a full notebook, and a copy of a book of whispers she'd found on the recommended by the internet shelf. She hadn't meant to read it all. She picked it up because the cover was soft and the title sounded gentle. But page after page, she found herself leaning closer, eyebrows lifting at every sarcastic scribble and gentle complaint. She read about Simon, Osbert, E.M., the cursed quill, the rooster. She read the modern responses too, a mother's scribble from Tokyo, a student in Cairo, a retired postman in Lisbon who wrote, "I never liked writing, until now. Turns out I just needed the right conversation partner." And then she reached the last page. There, in faint ink, was the quote that had followed the book for years. "If you are reading this, we are still alive." Ellie closed the book, held it for a while. Then, quietly, she pulled out a pencil. And in the margin, just beside that line, she added her own. It wasn't grand, or wise, or polished. It was just real. "I was lonely today. But this helped. Thank you. I think I'll write back." She closed the book, put it back on the shelf, and left. No one announced it as the final annotation. There was no certificate, no digital badge, no triumphant ending score. It was just another margin, another voice. But it felt complete, not because the story had ended, It hadn't. Margins don't really end. They stretch, linger, wait. But because that note, simple, honest, reminded everyone why they began, not to study, not to publish, but to listen and speak. Julian saw it later while visiting the library for a talk. He opened the book and paused. Read the line. Smiled. He turned to Imogen, who was flipping through another copy nearby. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Later that evening, someone else picked up the book, saw the same margin, paused, then wrote, "You're not alone." And so it continued. It's strange how stories loop. They don't always close with endings. Sometimes they fold in on themselves like a well-worn letter, creased, softened, carried too long in someone's pocket. What began as a grumble from a cold monk had become something more than even the most optimistic of scribes could have dreamed. And yet, the manuscript was still there. MS 147, the original, rested now in a custom archival cradle in Oxford, temperature-controlled, light-monitored, ink-preserved. Its pages no longer flaked, its bindings no longer cracked. It was safe. But it wasn't alone. Across the world, there were now copies, digital, printed, annotated, some in classrooms, some on coffee tables, some carefully packed into nightstand drawers like small, quiet friends. Each one held the same opening line. "Oh Lord, let this copying end." And each one, thanks to centuries of scribes, scholars, schoolchildren, and sleep-deprived readers, now ended with a chorus of replies. In the final exhibit created by the Quiet Network, visitors didn't just view the manuscript, they heard it, a soft, low soundscape. Not music, exactly. Just the sound of quills on parchment, fire crackling, distant murmurs, voices faded in and out, lines from the margins, layered in dozens of languages. Some were ancient, others just hours old, but none louder than a whisper. Visitors sat in soft chairs. They read illuminated screens. And in the corner, on a table with no label, sat a replica of the manuscript, unprotected, slightly smudged, accompanied by a single pencil. People still wrote in it. Julian retired quietly, many years later, not because the story had ended, but because it no longer needed him to tell it. He kept a personal copy on his shelf, full of notes from his travels, scribbles from strangers, and one line, always underlined in faded blue ink. "We are many. We are scribbling." He once said, "This isn't a story about a manuscript, it's a story about listening, and once you start listening, you can never quite stop." So here it is then. A manuscript that began as a burden, a scribble that became a conversation, a margin that became a message. Not because someone shouted, but because someone dared to whisper, and someone else, across centuries, whispered back. Somewhere tonight, a reader, maybe you, closes the book, exhales, and thinks, "I should write that down." And just like that, the circle closes. Not with silence, but with ink.